The night the storm hit, he wasn't chasing glory, he was chasing a thief. Yet in that blur of rain and sirens, he stumbled upon something far more powerful than crime or duty, a bond that would outlive both. The story that followed was carved not in headlines, but in loyalty sacrifice, and the silence shared between a man and the only soul who truly understood him. If you believe that courage can take any form, even 4 paws and a heartbeat, then stay hit like subscribe and tell me where you're watching from. The rain was relentless that night, falling in cold sheets that blurred the streetlights into streaks of gold and blue. Officer Daniel Hayes, 35, sprinted through the wet alleys of downtown Portland, his lungs burning, his radio crackling, and his boots splashing through puddles that mirrored the chaos of red and blue sirens behind him. A thief had snatched a woman's purse outside a diner and bolted through the old district, where the buildings leaned like tired ghosts. Daniel was fast, but the suspect was younger, lighter, slipping through shadows with the ease of someone who'd done this before. Suspect heading toward Burnside, his dispatcher's voice cut through the static, but Daniel didn't answer. He already knew. He turned a corner sharply, his flashlight slicing the dark, but the alley was empty. Only the echo of his own footsteps and the steady rhythm of the rain remained. He froze, scanning every doorway, every trash can, every flicker of motion. Then the city seemed to inhale and go still. No footsteps, no voices, not even the hum of a passing car, just rain and breathing. He knew the suspect couldn't have vanished. He was here somewhere. Then a sound that didn't belong. A low, deep bark echoed off the brick walls. It came again, sharper this time, urgent. Daniel turned his light landing on a rusted chain-link fence. Behind it stood a German Shepherd, ribs showing beneath matted fur, a frayed chain digging into its neck. The dog didn't flinch when Daniel stepped closer. Its eyes gleamed in the darkness, intelligent but wary, locked on something down the alley. "What's got your attention, buddy?" Daniel murmured, his voice low. The dog gave a short growl, then yanked on the chain toward a narrow path between 2 warehouses. It was strange, too deliberate to be random. For a split second, Daniel hesitated. He'd been a cop long enough to trust his gut, and right now his gut told him this animal wasn't barking for no reason. He looked at the dog, then at the chain, then back at the shadows where the thief could be hiding. "All right," he said softly. "Let's see what you're trying to tell me." He snapped the rusty latch off with his flashlight handle. The chain dropped with a clank, and the Shepherd bolted forward, splashing through the puddles like it had done this all its life. Daniel followed, heart-pounding hand on his weapon. They moved fast, cutting through the passage, until the dog stopped abruptly at a half-open warehouse door, scratched it twice, and stepped back, ears pinned flat. Daniel raised his flashlight. Inside, among a clutter of wooden crates and broken glass, a shadow moved. "Police!" he shouted, stepping inside. The thief spun around, eyes wide, clutching a knife. Before Daniel could react, the dog lunged, colliding with the man's chest. The knife clattered to the ground. The Shepherd growled, teeth bared, but controlled, pinning the man's arm to the floor. Daniel moved in fast, kicking the blade away, pulling the cuffs from his belt. "Stay down," he barked, pressing the suspect's wrists together. The man struggled, but the dog pressed harder, its muscles coiled like steel. "Easy, easy, boy," Daniel said as he clicked the cuffs shut. The Shepherd obeyed instantly, stepping back but keeping its body between the suspect and Daniel. The thief spat curses, but Daniel barely heard them. His eyes were on the dog standing in the dim light, soaked to the bone and trembling slightly. He noticed blood on the concrete. "You're hurt," Daniel murmured, crouching low. The dog's front paw was bleeding, a shallow cut from glass, maybe yet. It didn't make a sound. It just looked at him, steady calm, waiting for something. Approval, trust. Daniel extended his hand slowly, palm open. "It's okay," he whispered. The Shepherd sniffed. His hand hesitated, then let him touch its head. Its fur was coarse and wet, its body cold from the rain. But the warmth of that brief connection hit Daniel harder than the chase. Sirens grew louder in the distance. Backup was coming. Within minutes, 2 patrol cars pulled up, tires hissing on wet asphalt. "Nice work," Hayes, one of the officers, called out as they dragged the suspect out of the warehouse. "Where'd the K9 come from?" Daniel looked down at the dog sitting quietly by his leg tail, twitching once before stilling again. "He's not ours," Daniel said softly. "At least not yet." The other cop laughed, shaking his head. "Then you just got yourself a partner." Daniel smiled faintly. "Yeah," he said under his breath, glancing at the shepherd. "Maybe I did." The rain was easing into a drizzle now. The thief was shoved into the back of a cruiser, the flashing lights casting long shadows on the warehouse walls. Daniel turned to leave, but the dog didn't move. It stood still, watching him, as if unsure what came next. Daniel crouched again. "You coming, buddy?" The shepherd blinked, then limped forward, favoring its injured paw. Without another sound, it jumped into the back seat of Daniel's car, curling into the corner like it had done it before. Daniel climbed into the driver's seat, started the engine, and glanced in the rearview mirror. The dog was watching him, those amber eyes reflecting the streetlights as if carrying every story they'd seen. "You're something else," Daniel whispered, half smiling. The dog lowered its head onto the seat, exhausted but alert. As they drove through the nearly empty streets, Daniel couldn't shake the strange sense that he hadn't just caught a thief tonight, he'd been found himself. The radio crackled with reports of other calls, but Daniel turned the volume down, letting the rhythm of the wipers and the dog's soft breathing fill the car. The storm had finally passed, leaving the streets washed clean, but heavy with silence. Officer Daniel Hayes parked his cruiser outside the small veterinary clinic on Pine Street, its flickering neon sign casting a pale pink glow over the wet asphalt. Inside, the smell of antiseptic and rain filled the air. He carried the shepherd in his arms, its body heavier than it looked, fur still damp from the night before. The vet, Dr. Reynolds, met him at the door, a weary man in his 50s who looked like he had seen too many broken things patched together. "What happened here?" Reynolds asked, grabbing a towel. "Found him in an alley," Daniel said. "He's got a deep cut on his paw and maybe some bruising. He helped me stop a thief." The vet raised a brow. "Looks like he's been through more than one fight." They laid the dog gently on the table. It winced when Reynolds touched its paw, but didn't growl, didn't snap, didn't even pull away. Daniel stood beside the table, one hand resting near the dog's head, feeling strangely protective of this creature he'd only met hours ago. "He's underfed," Reynolds murmured. "Old scars, signs of stress. Might have been a working dog, maybe military or police K9. But he's got trauma. You can see it in the eyes." Daniel glanced down. The shepherd's gaze followed every movement, alert but quiet. Even through exhaustion, there was something deliberate in the way it watched him and understanding beyond words. "Will he make it?" Daniel asked. "He'll live," the vet said, "but he needs time, care, food, and trust." Daniel nodded slowly. "I can handle that." Reynolds gave him a long look. "You're planning to keep him?" Daniel hesitated, looking at the soaked uniform still clinging to him. "I don't know," he admitted, "but I owe him something." They sedated the dog lightly to clean and bandage the wound. As the medicine took effect, its eyes began to close and it exhaled a low sigh that seemed to release a lifetime of fear. Daniel stepped closer, brushing a hand against its fur. The dog's head leaned slightly into his palm, then stayed there asleep, but unwilling to let go. That simple motion caught Daniel off guard. He had seen people die, held victims' hands, faced violence on the streets, but this quiet gesture of trust from a broken animal made something in him ache. When Reynolds finished, he handed Daniel a clipboard. "You can leave him here overnight," he said. "We'll keep him stable." Daniel nodded, though something inside him resisted the idea of walking away. He bent down, whispering, "You're safe now. Okay, I'll check on you tomorrow." As he turned to leave, he felt a faint pressure against his fingers. The shepherd, half asleep, was nudging his hand weakly, refusing to break the touch. Daniel froze throat tight. "All right," he murmured. "You win." He stayed another 10 minutes, sitting beside the exam table, watching the dog's chest rise and fall. When he finally stepped outside, the first sunlight of dawn crept through the clouds, washing the street in gold. He drove home in silence, but every time he blinked, he saw those amber eyes staring back at him. The next morning, Daniel returned earlier than he planned. His uniform was still unpressed, his hair still damp from the shower he barely took. When he walked into the clinic, the receptionist looked up startled. "You're back early," she said. "Yeah," Daniel replied simply. "How's the shepherd better?" Now she smiled. "He wouldn't rest last night, kept whining and pacing. We couldn't figure out why until you walked in just now, look." They led him into the back room. The dog lifted its head immediately, tail thumping once against the metal table. "Told you," the vet said with a chuckle. "Guess he's picked his person." Daniel stepped closer. "Hey there, pal," he said softly. The shepherd's ears perked and its eyes brightened in recognition. When he held out his hand, the dog pressed its muzzle into his palm again, same as before, same quiet insistence. That gesture broke any last bit of hesitation he had. "What's his name?" Daniel asked. "No collar," the vet said. "No tag, no microchip. Might have been abandoned." Daniel frowned. He deserves a name. He thought for a moment, studying the dog's still face. "Let's call you Shadow," he said at last. "You showed up when no one else did." The dog blinked once, then rested its head against his arm. That was all the answer Daniel needed. Reynolds signed a few papers and handed them over. "If you're serious about this, Officer Hayes, he's your responsibility now." Daniel nodded, signing without hesitation. As he walked the dog outside, Shadow paused by the door, sniffing the air like it was rediscovering the world. Daniel opened the passenger side of his cruiser and motioned, "Hop in, partner." To his surprise, Shadow obeyed, climbing in carefully and settling on the seat, one paw still bandaged, eyes calm. The drive back was quiet. Daniel rolled the window down halfway, and the morning breeze fluttered through the car, carrying the scent of wet pine and city dust. Shadow leaned slightly towards the open air, ears twitching, every sense alive again. When they reached home, Daniel grabbed an old blanket from his couch, laying it near the heater. Shadow circled once before curling up, letting out a sigh that filled the apartment with peace. The next few weeks unfolded like a slow sunrise, the kind that doesn't blind you, but warms you quietly from the inside. Daniel's apartment began to feel alive again every morning, filled with the sound of claws gently clicking across the wooden floor and the soft rhythm of a breathing companion at his side. Shadow healed quickly. The wound on his paw closed faster than the vet expected, though he still carried a slight limp, something that gave him an oddly noble walk, as if every step was a reminder of battles survived. Daniel kept their days simple. They jogged at dawn through the riverfront, the mist rising like ghosts of old memories, and in the evenings they sat on the stoop watching traffic flow through the Portland twilight. Neighbors who had never spoken to Daniel before started waving. Some even stopped to ask about Shadow, drawn by his calm, watchful eyes and his quiet dignity. "He's not like other dogs," one woman said, petting Shadow's head. Daniel smiled. "He's not. He listens more than most people do." At the station, Shadow became something of a local legend. Officers joked that he was the unofficial mascot, but when Daniel walked in with him, everyone's tone softened. The dog didn't bark, didn't seek attention. He simply sat by Daniel's desk tail, thumping once in a while, eyes scanning the room like he was still on duty. Captain Morales raised an eyebrow the first time Shadow followed Daniel into the briefing room. "You bringing pets to work now, Hayes?" he asked. Daniel shrugged. "He's quieter than most of us, sir." The captain tried to look stern, but even he couldn't hide the small grin tugging at his mouth. "Just make sure he doesn't outrank you." By the end of the week, no one questioned Shadow's presence anymore. They all felt he belonged there, even if they didn't know why. One late afternoon after a long shift, Daniel took Shadow to the park near the river where the cherry trees lined the walking path. The sun was dipping low, throwing golden light across the water. A group of children played fetch nearby, laughing as their retriever bounded after a stick. Shadow watched but didn't move his ears, twitching faintly, his focus fixed not on the stick, but on something or someone at the edge of the park. An old man sat alone on a bench wearing a military jacket, faded with time, his hat pulled low over his eyes. Shadow's posture changed. His tail lifted slightly, and his body went still, as though recognizing a scent or a memory. Daniel frowned. "You know him?" he asked softly. But the dog had already started walking toward the man, slow and deliberate. The veteran looked up, confusion flickering in his eyes, before something else replaced it, shocked disbelief, then emotion so raw it made Daniel pause. The old man's lips trembled. "Shadow," he whispered. The dog stopped right in front of him, and for the first time since Daniel had known him, Shadow whined a soft, broken sound that cracked the air. The man reached out his hand, shaking as he touched Shadow's head. "I thought you were gone," he murmured. Daniel stepped closer, unsure if he should interrupt. "You know this dog?" The man nodded, tears sliding down his weathered cheeks. "I do. I was in the 45th unit with Officer Grant Miller. That dog saved my partner's life before the blast." Daniel blinked. "Blast?" "Yeah," the man said quietly. "Drug raid about 2 years back. Warehouse explosion. Miller didn't make it out. They said the dog didn't either." He looked at Shadow again, voice breaking. "Guess they were wrong." For a moment, time stilled. Daniel looked at Shadow, this silent, loyal creature who had appeared out of nowhere one rainy night, and felt a rush of understanding wash over him. The scars, the fear of loud sounds, the discipline, the quiet strength, it all made sense. Shadow wasn't just any dog. He was a soldier who had lost his home. Daniel sat beside the man. "I'm sorry for your loss," he said. The veteran nodded. "He used to sit just like this beside Miller," he whispered. "Never moved until he was told to. When the blast hit, he tried to drag Miller out, found them both under the debris. They thought Shadow didn't survive." Daniel swallowed hard. He must have wandered off after that. Somehow he found his way back into the city. The veteran smiled faintly through his tears. Some bonds don't end just because someone's gone. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a tarnished badge plate. This was Miller's. Keep it. He'd want whoever has Shadow to know his story. Daniel took the small plate reverently. It was scratched, burned around the edges, but still legible, Officer Grant Miller K-9 unit. The weight of it felt heavy in his palm. "Thank you," Daniel said, quietly. "For him." The man nodded. "He's special, you know. That dog, he's got more heart than most of us ever did." As the sun began to set, Daniel watched Shadow lay his head gently on the veteran's knee. It was a picture of two souls remembering someone who had meant everything to them. Daniel finally said, "Come on, Shadow." The dog looked up. Once, then stood obedient as ever. The veteran gave a final salute. "Take care of him, officer. He's seen enough pain for one lifetime." Daniel nodded solemnly. "I will." That night back at home, Daniel placed the metal plate on the mantel above his fireplace. Shadow sat in front of it, staring quietly, as if recognizing the name. "He was your partner, huh?" Daniel said softly. The dog's ears flicked. "Guess that makes us partners now." Morning light poured through the blinds, breaking into thin ribbons across the hardwood floor where Shadow slept beside Daniel's couch chest, rising and falling with the calm rhythm of trust. The air in the apartment smelled faintly of coffee and rain-damp fur, a strangely comforting scent that had become part of Daniel's mornings. Since learning the truth about Shadow's past, Daniel had felt an unspoken duty to honor the dog's legacy. He didn't see him as a pet, or even as a partner anymore, but as something rarer, an equal survivor. Every dawn before work, Daniel tied his shoelaces, while Shadow waited by the door, tail thumping softly, leash in mouth, as if saying, "Let's go." They ran along the river trail where the mist rose off the water like smoke, and the distant hum of traffic mixed with birdsong. The first few runs were awkward. Shadow's limp made Daniel slow his pace, but the dog never complained. Each time they returned, Shadow's endurance grew. Soon they were running in perfect sync, the rhythm of man and dog finding something close to peace. Daniel talked to Shadow more than he talked to anyone else. It wasn't the words that mattered. It was the release. "You know, partner," he'd say, between breaths. "People at the station think I'm crazy, bringing you along every shift. But you get it, don't you? You understand when to fight and when to be still." Shadow would glance up with that knowing look, as if agreeing without needing to. They practiced commands at the park sometimes. Sit, stay, heal. Even though Shadow had once been trained for tactical obedience, Daniel used softer tones, patient guidance, instead of the barked orders of his past life. It wasn't about discipline now. It was about rebuilding trust, brick by brick, command by command. One morning, fog blanketed the city so thick it felt like running through a dream. The bridge ahead was quiet, only the faint sound of a bike chain clicking somewhere up front. Daniel slowed when he saw a child maybe 8 years old wobbling near the railing. Before Daniel could call out, the front wheel slipped on wet metal, and the boy plunged headfirst into the river. "No," Daniel shouted, breaking into a sprint, but Shadow was already gone, a blur of motion tearing through the fog. The splash that followed echoed like thunder. Daniel reached the railing just in time to see Shadow swimming hard against the current, his strong legs cutting through the icy water with desperate precision. The boy surfaced once coughing, then went under again. Daniel's heart pounded helplessly as the dog dove beneath the surface. Seconds dragged into eternity before Shadow reappeared, gripping the boy's jacket in his jaws, hauling him towards the bank. Daniel ran along the bridge, sprinting down the embankment, mud splattering his uniform. By the time he reached them, Shadow had pulled the boy onto the shore and was nudging him with his nose, whining softly. The child coughed up river water, then burst into tears, clinging to the dog's neck. Daniel knelt beside them, eyes burning. "Good boy," he whispered hoarsely, his hands shaking as he checked the boy's pulse. It was strong. "Good boy, Shadow." The boy's mother arrived minutes later, hysterical, hugging her child and crying into his hair. She looked up at Daniel, then at the dripping wet shepherd standing proud beside him. "That dog, he saved my son," she sobbed. Daniel smiled faintly. "Yeah, he's good at that." By the time the ambulance arrived, Shadow stood still, shivering, but refusing to move until the boy was safely inside. Daniel wrapped his jacket around him, whispering, "You never stop, do you?" That night, he dried Shadow by the heater, rubbing the towel through the thick fur until it fluffed back up. Shadow closed his eyes, head leaning against Daniel's knee, content. "You're a hero again," Daniel said softly. "Doesn't feel new to you, huh?" He placed the small badge plate, Grant Miller's plate, on the table beside them. He'd be proud. The next morning, Daniel walked into the precinct, exhausted but lighter somehow. As soon as he stepped through the door, he noticed the whispers. "Did you see the news?" one officer asked another. "Some dog pulled a kid out of the river yesterday. Things going viral already." Daniel's heart skipped. He glanced at the bulletin board near the front desk. There it was, a blurry photo from someone's phone showing Shadow soaked and muddy beside the rescued boy headline reading, "Mystery Shepherd Saves Child from Drowning." "That's one hell of a dog," Malik said, clapping Daniel's shoulder. "Looks kinda like your mutt," Daniel chuckled, shaking his head. "Maybe he's got a twin somewhere." But inside, he felt pride swelling in his chest. For months, he had carried quiet guilt, feeling like he could never live up to the legacy of the man Shadow once served. But now, standing in that hallway, hearing his co-workers talk about the nameless hero, Daniel realized something profound. Shadow wasn't living in the past anymore. He was creating new stories, rewriting his own legacy, not as Grant Miller's dog, but as Daniel Hayes' partner. Later that evening, Captain Morales called Daniel into his office. "Hayes," he said, tossing a folded newspaper across the desk. "Your dog's on the front page." "Unknown hero dog of Portland." Daniel smirked. "He prefers to stay anonymous." The captain leaned back, studying him. "You know, I've seen men freeze in that kind of situation, but your shepherd didn't hesitate. That says a lot about both of you." Daniel nodded, unsure what to say. As he stood to leave, Morales added quietly, "Maybe it's time we made him official." Daniel paused. "Official K-9 certification," Morales said. "You train him, we can get him back on duty on your team." Daniel thought about it the whole drive home, glancing at Shadow in the passenger seat, tongue-out tail thumping lazily against the door. "Back on duty, huh?" he said. "You up for that?" Shadow looked at him with those calm, amber eyes that seemed to understand more than words could hold. By the time they reached home, Daniel had already decided. The next morning, they stood at the training field on the outskirts of the city. The grass was slick with dew, the air sharp with the smell of wet soil. Shadow stood beside him, alert, but relaxed, waiting for the first command. "All right, partner," Daniel whispered. "Let's see what you remember." Over the next few weeks, the two trained together, every day, search-tracking obedience drills. It wasn't easy. Shadow hesitated around loud noises, flinched at the crack of distant construction, but Daniel never raised his voice. Instead, he used calm encouragement, a hand on the shoulder, a simple good boy that meant more than any whistle or treat. Slowly, the fear faded. Summer settled into Portland like a heavy blanket, thick with warmth and noise. By July, the city buzzed with life barbecues, music, the smell of hot pavement after rain. For the first time in years, Daniel felt grounded. The days were long, the nights soft, and Shadow's transformation from a haunted soul into a loyal partner felt almost miraculous. Every morning they ran the Riverside Trail. Every evening they returned to the small apartment where Shadow's bed sat beside Daniel's chair near the window. It was peace, something Daniel had forgotten how to recognize. But even peace has its cracks, and sometimes all it takes is one sound to reopen old wounds. It started on a Saturday night. Daniel had just turned off the TV when the first explosion thundered across the sky. Fireworks, bright lights flashed through the blinds, coloring the walls red and blue. For most people, it was celebration. For Shadow, it was war. The dog bolted upright, ears back, eyes wide with panic. A second boom rattled the windows, and Shadow dove under the bed, trembling so violently the frame shook. Daniel's heart broke. He knelt, lifting the blanket, and saw the same look he'd seen in veterans' eyes, the 1,000-yard stare of someone reliving something they could never forget. Hey," he said, softly, reaching a hand under. "It's okay, buddy. You're home." But Shadow wouldn't move. His chest heaved with each breath, his nails scraping the floor. Daniel sat down on the carpet, leaning against the bed frame, and began to talk. He talked about nothing and everything about the day they met. The river, the training field, the quiet mornings when the world felt kind. Outside, explosions continued shaking the sky, but inside that room, Daniel's voice became an anchor. He stayed there for hours until the thunder faded, and Shadow finally crawled out exhausted, his head resting against Daniel's leg. "You're safe now, partner," Daniel whispered. "Nobody's gonna hurt you again." From that night forward, something shifted between them. Daniel realized that Shadow's strength didn't come from his training. It came from his heart, from the will to protect, no matter the cost, even when afraid. And Shadow learned that courage didn't always mean charging forward. Sometimes it meant trusting someone enough to let them stay close when the world got too loud. Life moved on. The 4th passed, the city returned to routine, and the precinct's pace quickened with summer's chaos. One humid Thursday afternoon, Daniel and Shadow were dispatched with a small tactical team to a suspected drug warehouse on the industrial edge of town. It was supposed to be routine, a quick sweep, a few arrests. The building looked ordinary from the outside, its corrugated metal walls covered in graffiti, the air thick with the smell of oil and heat. "Hayes, take the east side," Morales ordered through the headset. "Shadow's on point." Daniel patted his partner's side. "You ready?" The shepherd looked up, tail stiff alert, but steady. They moved silently through the doorway, stepping over shattered glass. Inside, the dim light flickered from overhead bulbs, the hum of machinery echoing through the empty hall. Shadow's ears pricked suddenly, his body tensing. Daniel stopped. "You smell something." The dog moved forward slowly, nose close to the ground, leading him toward a closed door. Before Daniel could call it in, the world erupted. A deafening boom shattered the hallway. The door blew inward, sending Daniel flying backward into the wall. The air filled with dust and heat alarms blaring, the floor shaking from the blast. His vision blurred. He tried to push himself up, but pain screamed through his ribs. "Control, this is Hayes," he gasped into the radio, coughing. "Explosion warehouse compromised." The line cut. Smoke poured into the corridor, turning everything gray. Somewhere in the distance, someone shouted his name, but it was muffled, fading. Daniel's hand slipped from the radio as darkness swam in from the edges of his sight. He barely registered the sound of claws scraping concrete before a familiar shape broke through the haze. Shadow. The dog darted through the smoke, his coat streaked with soot, eyes glowing fierce in the chaos. He barked once, sharp and commanding, then bit the edge of Daniel's jacket, pulling hard. Daniel groaned. "No, Shadow, get back." But the dog wouldn't leave. He tugged again, dragging Daniel inch by inch toward the exit, coughing through the toxic air. Flames licked at the walls, popping the pipes overhead, showering sparks across the floor. Shadow kept moving, coughing himself, eyes watering but unyielding. By the time they reached the outer doorway, another section of the ceiling collapsed behind them. Shadow barked in alarm, lunging forward just as the beam came down. He pushed Daniel clear, taking the brunt of the fall on his back. Daniel landed outside in the dirt, the blast of fresh air hitting his lungs like a punch. He rolled over, crawling to where Shadow lay beneath the smoking debris. "No, no, no, stay with me," he choked, pulling away the smaller pieces until he could see the dog's face. Shadow's chest rose shallowly, but his eyes were open, still focused on Daniel, tail twitching once. "Good boy," Daniel whispered, trembling. Sirens wailed in the distance, getting closer. Officers rushed toward them, shouting orders, dragging Daniel to his feet. "He's hurt," Daniel shouted back. "Help him first." Paramedics arrived moments later, lifting the dog carefully onto a stretcher oxygen mask fitted over his muzzle. Daniel rode with them, his uniform torn, his hands streaked with blood and ash. In the ambulance, Shadow's paw twitched weakly. Daniel held it, whispering, "You saved me again, partner. You don't stop, do you?" The vet hospital was ready when they arrived. The blast had left Shadow with bruised ribs, minor burns, and a dislocated shoulder, but no internal bleeding. "He's one tough son of a gun," the vet said, as Daniel sank into a chair. "He'll recover." Relief flooded him so hard, his knees almost gave out. For the next 2 days, Daniel barely left Shadow's side. He fed him by hand, talked him through the pain, and when Shadow whimpered in his sleep, Daniel sat by the bed, running a hand through his fur until the nightmares passed. When Morales visited, he placed a metal box on the bedside table. "For both of you," he said. Daniel shook his head. "He deserves it more." Morales smiled. "He already has it." The next week, when Shadow was strong enough to walk again, Daniel took him outside to the small courtyard behind the clinic. Autumn came quietly, slipping into Portland with gold leaves and gray skies washing away the heat and leaving behind a softer kind of stillness. For weeks after the explosion, Daniel and Shadow stayed close to home, walking slower, breathing deeper, learning how to move forward after surviving yet another close call. The scar along Daniel's ribs had faded, but it itched whenever it rained, and Shadow's fur had grown back where the burns once marked his shoulder. They were both healing physically, yes, but more than that spiritually. The nights were no longer restless. Shadow slept soundly beside Daniel's bed, no longer startled by thunder, as if the blast that once haunted him had finally burned itself out of his memory. On his days off, Daniel found peace in the smallest rituals, polishing his badge, folding his uniform, cleaning Shadow's gear. One rainy morning, as he sat by the window, brushing Shadow's collar, his fingers caught on something rough hidden under the leather lining. Curious, he unfastened the stitches carefully with a pocket knife until a small piece of metal fell into his hand, a weathered dog tag, the kind worn by military and police K9S. The letters were barely visible, tarnished by time and sweat, but when he wiped away the grime, the inscription came into view. To my brave partner, Shadow Forever, Brothers Grant. Daniel froze. The name hit him like a whisper from the past. Grant Miller. He'd heard it before the officer Shadow had once served with the man who never made it home. For a long moment, Daniel sat there in silence, staring at the tag as rain drummed softly against the window. Shadow looked up from where he was lying, tail brushing the floor, sensing something in the air. "This belonged to him," Daniel said quietly. "You carried it all this time, didn't you?" He ran his thumb over the engraved letters. The words weren't just metal. They were a bond sealed and hidden close to the heart. And now, somehow, that bond had found its way back into Daniel's hands. He knew what he had to do. That evening, he called in a few favors from the precinct and found an address outside of town, an old farmhouse near the foothills, listed under the name Emily Miller. The next morning, he loaded Shadow into the truck and drove through the winding roads that led out of the city. The forest gave way to open fields, the air crisper than it had been in months. As the house came into view, a white porch with peeling paint surrounded by maple trees shedding their leaves, Daniel felt a quiet tension settle in his chest. He parked by the gate and stepped out. Shadow followed, moving slowly, his nose twitching, as if already recognizing something familiar in the air. They walked up the gravel path together. When Daniel knocked on the door, a soft voice called from inside. "Coming." The door opened, revealing a woman in her 40s gray, beginning to touch the edges of her hair, her eyes weary but kind. "Can I help you?" she asked. Daniel removed his hat, holding it respectfully. "Ma'am, my name is Officer Daniel Hayes. I work with the Portland Police Department." Her face shifted slightly, alert, guarded. "I'm not in trouble, am I?" "No, ma'am," Daniel said. "I'm here because of your husband, Grant Miller." For a second, the world seemed to stop moving. The color drained from her face, and her eyes dropped to the dog standing quietly beside Daniel. Shadow hadn't made a sound since they arrived, but now, as if guided by something beyond instinct, he took a slow step forward. Emily's hand flew to her mouth. "Oh my God," she whispered, voice breaking. "Shadow." The dog tilted his head, tail wagging faintly, ears perked as he took another step. "Shadow, is that you?" Her voice cracked into tears. Shadow moved closer, closing the space between them, pressing his head against her leg like a child returning home after a long journey. Emily fell to her knees, wrapping her arms around his neck, sobbing. "You came home," she murmured, again and again. Daniel turned away for a moment, pretending to adjust his jacket, his throat tight. When she finally stood wiping her eyes, she looked at Daniel. "They told me he didn't survive. They told me they found nothing." Daniel handed her the tag. "He kept this with him," he said softly. "It was stitched into his collar. I think he never stopped looking for you." Emily took the tag with trembling hands, clutching it like a relic. "Grant loved this dog more than anything," she whispered. "They went through everything together. He said Shadow was the reason he made it home every night. Until..." She stopped, staring out the window toward the distant hills. "Until that night." Daniel nodded. "I've read the report. I know what happened." "No," she said, shaking her head. "You know what they wrote, but the truth is Grant went back for him. The building was on fire and they told him to get out, but he said, "I'm not leaving him behind." Her voice broke. He never made it out, but Shadow did. I guess part of him always wanted to finish that rescue. Daniel couldn't speak. He looked at Shadow standing by the window, now staring into the open fields, like he was remembering the sound of Grant's voice in the wind. Emily turned to Daniel. "He found you for a reason," she said. "You're giving him what Grant couldn't a second chance." She smiled sadly, brushing a hand over Shadow's fur. "I'm glad he found you." Before leaving, Daniel asked if she wanted to keep the tag, but she shook her head. "No," she said. "It belongs with him. You keep it. You're his family now." The drive back was quiet. The sun dipped low behind the trees, painting the sky in streaks of orange and red. Daniel glanced at Shadow in the rearview mirror. The dog was sitting upright, the faint wind from the window ruffling his fur, his expression calm but reflective. "She remembers you," Daniel said softly. "You did good, partner." At a red light, he looked at the tag in his hand again, feeling its cool metal press into his palm. "Forever brothers," he murmured. That night, Daniel hung the tag from the edge of Shadow's collar, again tucking it close to his chest where it belonged. Then he poured himself a drink and sat on the porch with Shadow at his feet, watching the stars emerge one by one. The air was still carrying the faint scent of pine and rain. Daniel spoke without looking down. "You know, I think he'd be proud of you. I think he'd be proud of both of us." Shadow shifted, pressing his body against Daniel's leg. For a while, neither of them moved. The night wrapped around them like a quiet promise, a bridge between the past and the present, between loss and redemption. Somewhere out there, Daniel thought a man named Grant Miller was finally at peace, knowing his brother had made it home. Winter was already creeping into Portland when the letter arrived, stamped with the city seal and addressed to Officer Daniel Hayes. He found it on his doorstep one early morning, half buried beneath the frost. The words inside were short, but carried a weight that made him sit in silence for a long time after reading them. "You and Shadow are hereby nominated for the City Medal of Valor." Daniel read it twice, then looked over at Shadow, who was sitting by the window, watching the fog roll across the street. "You hear that, partner?" he said, softly, smiling. They finally noticed. Shadow turned his head tail, flicking once in quiet acknowledgement, before returning his gaze to the fading horizon. The ceremony was set for the following month, a public recognition for the river rescue, the warehouse explosion, and years of quiet service that had changed lives even without official credit. Daniel wasn't sure how to feel. He'd never been one for attention, and Shadow, he knew, preferred silence over applause. Still, when the city called heroes, he knew his partner deserved his place among them. The weeks leading up to the event passed quickly, marked by the chill that settled in their bones and the warmth of routine that kept it away. Each morning, Daniel brewed coffee, while Shadow waited by the door, his leash coiled neatly beside him. They no longer ran long distances. Shadow's pace had slowed, and Daniel matched him step for step, careful not to push too far. They would walk the park trail together, the same path where the veteran once recognized him, the same river that had tested his courage. Daniel noticed the small signs first, the heavier breathing, the pauses in stride, the faint tremor that rippled through Shadow's front leg when he stood too long. But he said nothing. He didn't want to believe time could touch something that felt eternal. The day of the ceremony came wrapped in gray skies and drizzle. City Hall was filled with rows of polished seats and the faint hum of conversation. Banners hung from the walls, and at the center of the stage stood a podium draped with the words "For bravery beyond duty." Daniel adjusted his tie awkwardly, glancing down at Shadow, who sat poised beside him, fur-brushed badge plate gleaming against his collar. "You look better than me," Daniel muttered. The dog tilted his head as if to agree. When they were called forward, applause filled the hall, loud, genuine, unrestrained. Flashbulbs popped, cameras turned. Daniel walked onto the stage with Shadow beside him, every step echoing the bond that had brought them there. The mayor shook his hand, saying words Daniel barely heard. Then a uniformed officer approached carrying a small velvet box. Inside, on a satin cushion, lay a gold medal engraved with their names. Daniel's throat tightened as he took it. He bent down to fasten it around Shadow's neck, hands trembling slightly. The medal rested against the tag from Grant Miller, the two medals touching as though completing a circle long unfinished. "This belongs to you," Daniel whispered. And that was when it happened, something small, almost imperceptible, yet deeply human. As Daniel adjusted the ribbon, Shadow raised his paw and placed it gently on Daniel's hand, his eyes soft and steady. The hall went silent. No command had been given, no trick rehearsed. It was instinct, pure and unspoken, the language of loyalty that transcended all others. Daniel froze, staring into those amber eyes that had seen both the worst and the best of humanity. "Yeah," he whispered, "I know." The audience erupted again, but neither of them moved. For that brief moment, time itself bowed its head. Afterward, they stepped off stage together into the cold air outside. The rain had turned to mist, coating the city in silver. Shadow shook himself, once tail wagging lazily. "You did good," Daniel said. "Guess that makes us official heroes now." Shadow's response was a slow blink and a soft sigh, the kind that meant he didn't care about medals or applause, only the man beside him. They went home in silence, both tired but content. Daniel hung his dress uniform on the chair and set the medal on the mantel right next to Grant Miller's tag. Shadow curled up near the fireplace, paws tucked under eyes half closed. The house felt warmer that night, full of something larger than either of them could name. But as the days passed, Daniel began to notice subtle changes. The coughing came first, a dry, rasping sound in the middle of the night. Then the limp grew worse, no longer fading after rest. He took Shadow to the clinic again, his gut already tight with dread. Dr. Reynolds greeted them with the same kind smile, but a different tone in his voice. "He's aging faster than most," the vet said, listening to Shadow's heartbeat through the stethoscope. "Years of strain smoke stress, it takes its toll. His heart's weak, Daniel. You need to slow him down." Daniel nodded, forcing the words out. How long? Reynolds hesitated. Months, maybe a year if he's lucky and careful. But he's strong. He'll fight for you until the end. Daniel sat quietly in the small room as Shadow rested his head on his lap. He stroked the dog's fur slowly, the same fur that had once been covered in soot blood, and Rain, the same body that had carried others out of danger without hesitation. "You've done enough fighting," Daniel murmured. "No more pain, all right. Just rest now." The drive home was quiet, the radio off the windows slightly cracked to let in the cool air. Shadow leaned his head on the armrest, eyes half closed, wind brushing his muzzle. When they reached home, Daniel carried him up the stairs, even though Shadow protested with a low grunt. "Yeah, I know, tough guy," he said, smiling sadly. "You carried me once. My turn." That night, Daniel lay on the floor beside him, unable to bring himself to move to the bed. Shadow's breathing was steady, but slower, deeper. Daniel traced the outlines of the metals with his fingers, the way the two pieces of metal caught the firelight like distant stars. He thought of everything they'd survived. The storm, the fire, the rescue, the silence between every heartbeat that had almost ended them both. "You're not just a dog," he whispered. "You're the best partner I've ever had." Shadow shifted, pressing his paw against Daniel's chest, right above his heart. It was weak, but deliberate. Daniel laughed quietly, the sound catching in his throat. "Yeah, I know. I hear you." Over the next few weeks, Daniel rearranged his schedule to spend more time at home. He cooked meals while Shadow watched from the corner, always waiting for a small piece of chicken tossed his way. The first snow of winter came earlier than expected that year, falling thick and heavy across Portland and painting the city in quiet white. For Daniel, the cold had always carried a strange beauty, but lately it also carried worry. Shadow's cough had grown worse, his movement slower, yet he still insisted on following Daniel everywhere, tail wagging weakly whenever Daniel reached for his coat. The vet's words echoed in Daniel's mind every morning, months, maybe a year, but neither of them lived by the clock anymore. They lived by the moments, the small things that mattered. Morning walk, soft sunlight through frosted windows, and the way Shadow still waited by the door, eager to go, even when his legs trembled. The medal from City Hall now hung beside the old tag on the wall, the two medals gleaming side by side. Daniel often caught himself staring at them when the house was quiet, thinking about all they had endured together. He'd given up chasing heroics. Now his mission was simple, to make sure Shadow's final chapter was written in peace. But fate had other plans. One night, as the snowstorm howled across the city, the police scanner broke through the static with an urgent report: child missing near Timberline Trail, last seen wearing a red jacket. Daniel froze mid-step, coffee cup half raised. He looked down at Shadow, who had already lifted his head ears, twitching despite the dullness of age. "No," Daniel said quietly. "You can't, buddy. You're not ready for that." Shadow stood anyway, limping toward the door. He looked back at Daniel with those same determined amber eyes that had defied explosions, rivers, and fear. Daniel exhaled slowly. "You never listen, do you?" Within an hour, he was on the road, snow swirling around the truck like ghosts. The drive into the mountains was treacherous, visibility almost zero, but he didn't turn back. The rescue team had already been deployed, and Daniel's radio buzzed with fragments of their conversation. Tracks found near the ridge. Winds picking up, temperature dropping fast. When he arrived at the base camp, the storm was a living thing, roaring, biting, unforgiving. Officers huddled in groups checking maps and radio frequencies. Captain Morales spotted him. "Hayes, you shouldn't be here. Your partner's not fit for this." Daniel glanced down at Shadow, who was already straining against the leash nose to the ground, tail raised. "Try telling him," that Daniel replied. Morales sighed. "Fine, but if he falters, you get him out. Understood?" Daniel nodded. They began the climb at dusk, flashlights cutting through the swirling white. The world narrowed to breath and motion, the crunch of boots in snow, the low hum of wind, the faint glow of flares in the distance. Shadow led the way, head down, moving with a precision that defied his age. His training, buried beneath months of rest, reawakened in full. Every few yards he paused, sniffed the air, then pressed forward with renewed focus. The higher they climbed, the colder it grew. Ice clung to Daniel's lashes, his fingers numb despite the gloves. He kept one hand on Shadow's harness, trusting him more than the compass. Hours passed. The storm thickened. The radio crackled faintly of visibility zero. No sign yet. Then suddenly, Shadow stopped. His body stiffened, tail straight, nose pointed toward a snowbank near a cluster of pines. He began digging, barking, once sharp, urgent, commanding. Daniel rushed to his side, falling to his knees. "What is it, boy?" The answer came in a glimpse of red fabric, buried beneath the snow. "Over here," Daniel shouted into the wind. The team converged, shovels tearing into the icy ground. Within seconds, they uncovered a small child, barely conscious, lips, blue eyes fluttering. "He's alive," one rescuer yelled. Shadow immediately pressed close, curling around the boy, his thick body shielding him from the wind. Daniel wrapped his own jacket over both of them. "Hang in there, kid," he whispered, checking for a pulse, faint but steady. The helicopter couldn't land in the blizzard, so they had to wait for the weather to ease. For over an hour, Shadow stayed locked in place, using his body heat to keep the child warm. The snow piled on his back, freezing into his fur, but he never moved. Daniel tried to pull him back once, but Shadow growled softly, not out of anger, but determination. "All right," Daniel said, voice cracking. "All right, buddy, we'll wait together." When the storm finally began to fade, the sound of rotor blades cut through the silence. The rescue team waved flares, signaling the medics. Daniel helped lift the boy into the stretcher, then turned to call for Shadow. "Come on, partner, it's over." Shadow didn't respond. He was lying still now, chest rising, shallowly ice forming along the edges of his fur. Daniel dropped to his knees. "No, no, no," he whispered, scooping the dog into his arms. "Not like this." Shadow's eyes fluttered open for a moment, focusing on Daniel's face. His breathing was ragged, but his gaze was calm. He managed to lift his paw weakly, resting it against Daniel's chest. "You did it," Daniel said through tears. "You saved him." The helicopter crew ran over, but Daniel waved them off. "I've got him," he said, holding Shadow close. They flew down the mountain together, the boy stable Shadow wrapped in a thermal blanket on Daniel's lap. The warmth from the heater did little to fight the chill settling into his bones. At the clinic, they rushed Shadow into emergency care. Dr. Reynolds met them at the door, his face grave. "Hypothermia," he said quickly. "We'll do everything we can." Daniel paced the hallway for what felt like hours, listening to the faint sounds of machines and hushed voices behind the door. When Reynolds finally emerged, his expression said everything. "He's hanging on," he said quietly. "But he's tired, Daniel. Really tired." The next morning came softly, the kind of morning that carried silence heavy enough to break the strongest heart. Snow still blanketed the streets outside, the air sharp with the scent of winter and antiseptic drifting through the clinic halls. Daniel sat in the same chair he'd occupied all night, his hands resting on the edge of Shadow's blanket, watching the slow rise and fall of the dog's chest. Machines hummed gently in the background, each beep marking another second of borrowed time. He hadn't slept. He couldn't. Every time his eyelids fell, memories flooded in the river, the chase, the medals, the look in Shadow's eyes when he'd leapt into the freezing water to save that boy. It was impossible to reconcile the quiet stillness of the dog before him with the warrior that had lived through so much fire. Dr. Reynolds came in quietly, checking the monitors, his face unreadable. "He's weak," he said softly. "His body's shutting down, but his heart's holding on. That's what they do, the good ones. They hold on for us." Daniel nodded, unable to speak, his throat raw from the long night of unspoken prayers. "You should take him home," Reynolds said after a moment. "Let him rest where he belongs." Daniel looked at the snow falling outside, the world wrapped in white silence, and whispered, "Yeah, he deserves that." They helped him lift Shadow gently into the truck, wrapping him in a heavy blanket. The dog's head rested in Daniel's lap, the whole drive home, eyes barely open, but still watching him. Every turn of the tires felt like the ticking of a clock, winding down each mile, one closer to goodbye. By the time they reached the house, dawn had fully broken. The light spilling through the windshield painted everything gold, the snow, the trees, even the tired lines on Daniel's face. He parked by the curb and just sat there for a moment, his hand resting on Shadow's neck. "We're home, partner," he said quietly. "We made it." He carried Shadow inside, laying him on the blanket near the fireplace, the same spot where he had napped after the medal ceremony. The house felt impossibly still. Every sound amplified: the creak of the floorboards, the soft hum of the heater, the whisper of the snow melting against the window pane. Daniel sat beside him, legs crossed, one hand tracing the edge of the old tag still fastened to the collar. "To my brave partner Shadow forever, Brothers Grant." The words shimmered faintly in the firelight, and Daniel felt tears rise again. "He'd be proud of you," he murmured. "You finished what he started." Shadow shifted slightly, his eyes opening halfway, a gaze finding Daniel's face. The warmth that had always lived there was still present, though dimmer now, like the last glow of embers before the fire fades. Daniel smiled through the ache. "You've always been stronger than anyone gave you credit for, even me." The hours passed in slow motion. Daniel made coffee, but never drank it. He turned off his phone. Time had no meaning anymore. It was just the two of them, as it had always been, the storm-born pair who'd found each other in the rain. At one point, Shadow stirred, his body trembling as he tried to push himself up. Hey, easy," Daniel said, quickly moving to steady him, but Shadow ignored the weakness, using every ounce of strength left to rise halfway his legs, unsteady breath, shallow. He leaned forward, pressing his muzzle against Daniel's chest, right where the badge rested on his uniform. The contact was deliberate, heavy with meaning. Daniel froze, tears spilling over. "You're giving it back to me," he whispered. "You think your job's done." Shadow's tail moved once a faint tap against the floor, before he lay back down, his head resting on Daniel's knee. Outside, the wind picked up, brushing the snow from the trees. The room glowed with soft morning light, and for the first time in months, everything was perfectly still. Daniel stroked Shadow's fur, slowly memorizing every line of him, the scars, the rough patches, the gray along his muzzle. "You don't have to fight anymore," he said, voice trembling. "You've done more than anyone ever asked. You've saved lives. You've saved me." Shadow blinked slowly, the corners of his mouth twitching in something almost like a smile. Then his breathing slowed. Once, twice. A pause. The kind of pause that leaves space for realization to catch up to grief. "No," Daniel whispered. "Please." He bent lower, listening, willing another breath to come, another heartbeat to rise beneath his hand. But it didn't. Shadow's chest fell one final time and didn't lift again. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of everything they had shared, every chase, every rescue, every quiet night by the fire. Daniel pressed his forehead against the dogs and stayed there for what felt like hours, his tears soaking into the fur that had weathered so many storms. "You're home now, partner," he said softly, voice breaking. "You're home." When the sun fully rose, it filled the room with golden light that wrapped around them both like a benediction. The metals on the mantel caught the glow, scattering reflections across the walls. One beam landed on Shadow's collar, glinting off the inscription, "Forever Brothers." Later that day, Daniel buried Shadow beneath the oak tree behind the house, the same tree they'd sat under on summer afternoons. The ground was cold, but the sky was clear, and the wind whispered through the branches like a prayer. He laid the blanket down carefully, tucking the collar and the tag against Shadow's chest, and covered him with the earth, each handful heavier than the last. When it was done, he placed the Medal of Valor atop the fresh mound. "You earned it more than I ever did," he murmured. A year passed, but the world never really returned to what it had been. Time moved forward like the slow thaw after winter, inevitable, patient, but heavy with the silence that follows loss. The snow melted the oak tree behind the house, grew thick with new leaves, and every morning Daniel still poured 2 cups of coffee out of habit, one for himself and one for the empty space near the window where Shadow used to sit. The house no longer smelled of fur and wet earth, only polish and quiet. Yet somehow, in the stillness, Daniel felt that his old partner had never truly left. There were moments, the whisper of a breeze at dusk, the faint creak of the porch at night, when he swore he could still hear Shadow's paws padding softly across the floor. He'd stopped wearing his badge for a while, choosing instead to work behind the desk at the precinct. The younger officers often came to him for advice, calling him Old Man Hayes with a grin. But when they left, Daniel would see the way they looked at the photo frame on his desk, the one of him kneeling beside a proud German shepherd wearing the Medal of Valor. The caption underneath read simply, "Officer Hayes and Shadow Portland, PD, K9 Division, 2023. Some days that picture was all he needed to keep going. Others it felt like a wound that refused to close. He visited the oak tree often, sitting by the small plaque that bore Shadow's name. The ground had settled smooth now, covered in grass, but Daniel could still trace the outline of the collar buried beneath. He'd talk about his day, about the rookies at the station, about how the world had gotten faster and louder, but somehow emptier too. "You'd hate the sirens these days," he'd say, laughing softly. "They're all digital now. Too clean. You liked the messy kind." And when the wind would stir the branches above him, he'd take it as a reply. Then one spring afternoon, something changed. It was a day like any other. A light drizzle, the city yawning into life, and Daniel had stopped by the shelter on a routine check. He didn't plan to stay long. He'd visited often since Shadow's death, bringing donations, helping with training, quietly paying adoption fees for dogs that nobody wanted. But that day, as he walked past the kennels, a faint bark caught his attention. It wasn't loud or frantic, just steady calm, the way Shadow used to sound when trying to get his attention without startling him. Daniel turned and saw a small German Shepherd puppy sitting at the back of the cage, watching him intently. Its fur was darker, its ears too big for its head, but those eyes were the same amber hue that had once followed him through every storm. "You've got to be kidding me," Daniel whispered, crouching. The puppy tilted its head and let out a small whine, pawing gently at the gate. The shelter worker walked over, smiling. "That's a smart one, came in last week, doesn't like anyone touching him except me." "You want to meet him?" Daniel hesitated, heart thudding, then nodded. The moment the gate opened, the puppy trotted straight toward him, tail wagging shyly, and pressed its forehead against his knee. Daniel froze, staring down at the tiny creature leaning into him as though they'd known each other for years. "What's his name?" he asked quietly. "No name yet," the worker said. "You can give him one." Daniel looked at the puppy again and felt something old and sacred stir in his chest. "Echo," he said. "His name is Echo." The worker smiled. "Echo, I like that." Daniel smiled too, whispering to the puppy, because heroes never die, kid. They just echo in the hearts they've touched. He filled out the adoption papers that afternoon. The ride home was strangely emotional, half joy, half guilt. But as the truck rolled past the familiar turn toward his house, the puppy crawled onto his lap, nose pressed against his arm the same way Shadow used to ride on their first drive together. When they arrived, Daniel let Echo explore the living room. The puppy trotted across the floor, sniffing every corner until it reached the fireplace. It stopped there, staring up at the mantel where the Medal of Valor and Grant Miller's tag still rested side by side. Then slowly Echo sat down and barked, once a quiet but firm sound. Daniel stood frozen, every hair on his arms rising. "You found him, didn't you?" he whispered. "You know he's here." Echo looked back, tail wagging once before curling up on the rug right in Shadow's old spot. That night, Daniel lit the fire and sat in his chair, watching the flames dance across the metal. The shadows flickered against the wall, and for a moment he could almost see two shapes there, one large and steady, the other small and growing beside it. "Looks like we're starting over, partner," Daniel said softly. "Different name, same heart." The next months felt like déjà vu, the training the early mornings, the laughter that returned to the house. Echo was clumsy, but brilliant, fearless yet gentle every mistake, a reflection of youth rather than defiance. Daniel found himself smiling again, realizing that this wasn't replacing what he lost, but continuing what he'd been given. Shadow had taught him that loyalty wasn't about ownership, it was about legacy. And now that legacy had found a heartbeat again. The year came full circle when the department held its annual memorial for fallen officers and service dogs. Daniel almost didn't go, but Morales insisted. "You'll want to see this," the captain said with a knowing look. The auditorium was packed, filled with uniforms and memories. At the front of the stage, a large curtain covered a new addition to the Wall of Honor. When the mayor stepped up to speak, her words echoed through the hall. And some heroes never stop serving, even after they're gone. Today, we honor one such hero, K9 Shadow, whose courage saved lives and whose loyalty reminded us all what duty truly means. The curtain dropped, revealing a bronze statue of Shadow standing proud, head slightly tilted eyes cast toward a plaque engraved with both his name and Grant Miller's. The crowd rose to their feet, the sound of applause filling the space. Daniel stood frozen, his throat tight, as he saw the familiar stance immortalized in metal, the posture that had once guarded him through fire and storm. Echo, sitting beside him, barked once loud and clear, as if recognizing his predecessor. Laughter and tears rippled through the audience. Daniel knelt, resting a hand on Echo's back, whispering, "He hears you." After the ceremony, Daniel waited until everyone had left. He stood alone before the statue, tracing the engraved words at the base. He wasn't just a dog, he was family. He smiled, faintly, eyes glistening. "You still are," he said. As he turned to leave, the afternoon sun broke through the clouds, striking the statue so that it gleamed in gold. Echo stopped, looked back, and wagged his tail twice before trotting after him. And in that moment, Daniel understood the truth that had taken him years to find. Love and loyalty don't end when life does. They change form, they echo, they continue. Some partnerships don't fade. They live on in the next breath, the next heartbeat, the next brave soul who chooses to love again after loss. As they walked out into the cold, Echo nudged Daniel's hand with his nose. Daniel chuckled softly. "Yeah, I know," he said. "Let's go home." And as they disappeared down the sunlit steps, the bronze shepherd watched silently over the city. It once protected its shadow, stretching long across the stone, eternal, unwavering, and whole. The end. Before you go, take a moment to breathe and let this story settle. If Shadow and Daniel's journey moved you even a little, if their bond reminded you that loyalty and love can outlast loss itself, don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more stories that touch the heart. I want to know, what part hit you the hardest? Was it the storm where they first met, the rescue in the snow, or that quiet goodbye under the oak tree? Tell me your favorite moment in the comments and share where you're watching from. I read every story, every city, every heart that connects with these tales. Because when we share them, the memory of heroes like Shadow never fades. They live again through every word, every tear, and every person who remembers.